You're listening to 105.3, The Gerblin, Dominaria's #1 music source for generic goblin noise.
Hey gang, just to let you know, you can now use the promo code MTGMudsta, all caps, at flipsidegaming.com and originalmagicart.store. Using the code gets you 10% off orders $10 or more, and you get to help out the channel at the same time. Also, I want to bring to your attention the Kickstarter from Original Magic Art, where they're trying to get some sweet Commander/EDH generals onto playmats. He's directly working with the artists, so you'll be able to help support them, and if you use the affiliate link below, you'll also be able to help support me and get your hands on some of these sweet playmats. Alright, this week we have 2 new faces and 2 new commanders played by some old friends. This week, Jameson is playing his Yuriko deck, keeping Unclaimed Territory, Island, Aminachu's Augury, Ninja of the Deep Hours, Chromatic Lantern, Counterspell, and Tetsuko Umezawa. We got Jameson's buddy Chris playing his Avacyn deck, keeping 2 Plains, Homeward Path, Hour of Revelation, Path to Exile, and a Baneslayer Angel. Next we have Marco playing his Anafenza deck, keeping Strip Mine, Woodland Cemetery, Fetid Heath, Godless Shrine, Reflecting Pool, Protean Hulk, and Shouldred. And last but not least, we have Josh, who played the Bloodpod deck last time, playing Sram, and he keeps Joyous Familiar, Sword of the Animist, Bone Saw, Overwhelming Splendor, Boundary Inspector, Remember the Fallen, and Buried Ruin. Marco wins the die roll, and he starts us off. Marco plays a Godless Shrine, having it come in tapped, and he passes. Chris plays a Plains, and passes. Jameson plays an Unclaimed Territory, and names ninjas. Josh plays a Plains, and also passes. Marco plays a Woodland Cemetery, which comes in untapped, and he passes turn. Chris plays a Plains, and passes to Jameson. Jameson plays an Island, and he casts Tetsuko Umezawa. Josh draws and plays a Buried Ruin, casting his commander, Sram. He then casts a Bone Saw, and he draws from Sram's on-cast trigger before passing turn. Marco plays a Reflecting Pool, and he brings out Anafenza. He passes, but at the end of turn, Chris exiles the newly cast commander with Path to Exile, grabs a forest, and Chris starts his turn. Chris has nothing to do but play a Plains, and he passes. Jameson plays an Island, and he swings to Shiro at Marco. As he can't block, Jameson is able to activate Yuriko's Commander Ninjutsu when moving from the blocker step. Marco takes 1 commander damage, and Jameson reveals the top card for Yuriko's triggered ability, revealing a land and unfortunately deals no damage. Josh plays a Plains, and he casts a Foundry Inspector. This lets him cast a Golem Skin Gauntlet for free, and Josh draws a card from Sran's on-cast trigger. Marco pays 4 to cast an Oracle of Moldiah, revealing the top card of his library. As it's not a land, he then plays a Fetid Heath and a Strip Mine from his hand as his lands for turn. Chris drops a Plains, and he casts a Herald's Horn, naming Angels. He then passes turn. Jameson plays a Sunken Hollow as his land for turn, and he pays 2 to cast a Strionic Resonator. He then attacks Chris with Yuriko, who hits him for 1. Jameson pays 2 to copy Yuriko's triggered ability with the Strionic Resonator, and he reveals for the first copy hitting a land, and then writes a replication, and his opponents take 4. Josh plays an Ancient Tomb, and taps it taking 2. He casts Joyous Familiar, which then lets him cast Sword of the Animist for free, drawing as he casts from Sram's ability. He then pays 1 for Sword of War and Peace, drawing again. Josh then equips the Bone Saw to Sram, and he swings his commander at Marco. Marco takes the hit for 3, and Josh then passes. Marco draws and reveals an Ulamog on top of his library. He taps a forest, and he casts Crop Rotation, sacrificing the tapped forest to go and find Gaia's Cradle. Marco then plays a forest off the top after he shuffles, and he casts Shouldred before passing to Chris. Chris's Horn triggers, but it isn't an angel, so he draws the card normally. He plays a Plains, and we then see a Cleansing Nova hit the stack. Being the hero the table needs, Chris chooses to destroy all the artifacts, and he passes. Jameson sacrifices Yuriko on his upkeep, and he plays an Isolated Watchtower as his land for turn. He then casts Chromatic Lantern in his main phase, and he recasts his commander, passing to Josh. Josh loses Sram as well on his upkeep, and he drops a Mace of Ith as his land for turn. He then passes to Marco. Marco draws and reveals a Dread Return off the top of his library. We then see a Gamekeeper come in during Marco's main phase, and he moves to combat. He swings Shoulder to Jameson as he has a Swamp, and the Oracle at Chris, who has no blockers. The guys take the damage, and Marco passes. Chris draws and plays a Homeward Path as his land for turn. He then passes. Jameson sacrifices Yuriko to Shouldred on his upkeep, and then casts Coalition Relic. He passes, and at the end of turn, Josh cycles Forsake the Worldly to draw a card. Josh plays a Plains, and we see Remember the Fallen hit the stack, taking 2 as he tapped his Ancient Tomb again. He returns the Familiar and the Sword of the Animus to hand, and he passes turn. Marco draws for turn and reveals Greater Good off the top. He recasts his commander in his main phase, but Jameson counters it with a counterspell. Moving to combat, Marco retaliates by attacking Jameson with everything for a total of 10 damage. At the end of turn, Jameson puts a charge counter on his relic. Chris plays a Buried Ruin as his land for turn, and lets the table know he isn't bothered by any of this. He then passes to Jameson. Jameson removes his charge counter and gains a mana in his main phase. He uses it and a land to recast Tetsuko, and we then see the copy of Writer Replication he drew earlier make a token copy of Marco's Shouldered. With nothing else, he passes. Josh has 2 shoulder triggers to deal with on his upkeep, which he handles with such grace that is often unseen in a game of Magic. He then plays a Plains for his turn, and he casts a Gilded Lotus in his main phase, taking 2 from the Ancient Tomb. Marco sacrifices his Gamekeeper to Jameson's shoulder trigger, and exiles it as it dies. He only needs to reveal 1 card beyond the Greater Good to hit Kambal, and he puts the Greater Good into his graveyard. Marco then draws for turn and reveals the Soul Ring off the top. He then casts a Protean Hulk before moving to combat. He swings Shouldered at Josh and the Oracle at Chris. Josh untaps Shouldered with his Maze, and Chris takes 2. At the end of turn, Chris sacrifices his Buried Ruin to return the Herald's Horn to his hand. Chris draws for turn and casts an Hour of Revelation in his main phase. This triggers Kambal's ability, and Chris gets drained for 2. With the Protean Hulk dying, Marco gets to go and find as many creatures as he wants, as long as they cost no more than 6 converted mana costs together. He grabs Karmic Guide and Viscera Seer. With the Karmic Guide entering, he gets to bring back his Protean Hulk, and with nothing else, Chris passes turn. Jameson draws for turn, and with nothing else passes. Josh untaps and takes 2 life loss as he taps his Ancient Tomb to help recast Jarvis Familiar. Marco lets the Karmic Guide die in his upkeep, and he draws for turn. He casts Journey to Eternity onto his Protean Hulk in his first main phase, but Jameson counters that as well with an Insidious Will. Marco then pays 4 to cast Dread Return, and he brings back his Karmic Guide, who in turn brings back his Oracle of Moldiah. He then reveals Plaguecrafter off the top, and moving to combat, hits Chris for 6. Chris draws for turn but has no land to play. He casts a Herald of War, who should hopefully help him reduce the cost of his expensive angels moving forward, and he passes. Jameson plays a Swamp for his turn, and he casts Ninja the Deep Hours. He then passes to Josh. Josh casts an Inspiring Statuary in his main phase, taking 2 from the Ancient Tomb. He then brings in Sram, and he pays 1 to recast the Sword of the Animist, drawing from Sram. He then passes to Marco. Marco draws for turn and reveals a Swamp which he plays. This reveals another Swamp which he also plays. Marco then casts Plaguecrafter, which forces everyone to sacrifice a creature. Moving to combat, Marco swings all of his creatures at Chris and deals 9. Chris draws for turn but still can't find a land. He casts a Herald's Horn again, naming Angels, which helps him reduce the cost of Linvala, who he then casts. He passes to Jameson. Jameson plays a Dwar Isle Refuge as his land for turn, and he gains 1 life. He then recasts Yuriko and passes. At the end of turn, Josh casts Cribsop on Marco's Protean Hulk. In response to the spell targeting the Hulk, Marco flashes in Necromancy to bring back the Karmic Guide. This in turn brings back the Plaguecrafter, which forces everyone to sacrifice a creature, with Marco sacrificing his Protean Hulk, and he gets to go and find Twilight Shepherd. With the Shepherd hitting the field, Marco puts the Hulk back to his hand. The Karmic Guide also dies due to it having protection from black, which means that the Necromancy can't enchant it. Josh taps his artifacts and some lands, taking 2 from the Ancient Tomb to recast Sram. He casts a Bloodforged Battleaxe once his commander resolves, and draws from casting the equipment. Josh then casts Trailblazer's Boots, drawing once more, and he passes to Marco. Marco draws and places Savannah as his land for turn, and we see a Midnight Reaper hit the field. We then see the Hulk hit the field again, and Marco moves to combat. He swings the Oracle and the Seer at Chris for 3, the Plaguecrafter at Jameson for 3, and the Twilight Shepherd at Josh for 5. Josh removes the Shepherd from combat with his Maze of Ith, and Marco then passes turn. Chris reveals a Karmic Guide off the top with his Horns trigger, drawing it and then drawing for turn. He then casts a Pearl Medallion, reducing his spells by 1, and Chris's Karmic Guide comes out to play. Responding to the trigger, Marco sacrifices his Plague Reaper to the Viscera Seer, losing 1 life and drawing from the Reaper trigger, then scrying 1 and keeping the Ravenous Chupacabra on top. The Karmic Guide trigger then resolves, and Chris brings back his Linvala. Moving to Chris's combat step, Marco casts Wake the Dead, where X is 3, and he brings back Plaguecrafter, Karmic Guide, and Kambal. This lets Marco bring back his Shouldered with the Karmic Guide, and then everyone sacrifices a creature. and Marco lets his Karmic Eye die, losing 1 life and drawing a card from the Midnight Reaper trigger. We then move to the end step, and Marco sacrifices the 2 remaining creatures, losing 2 life and drawing 2 cards to his Midnight Reaper triggers. Jameson plays a command tower as his land for turn, and he taps out to cast Aminatu's Augury. He exiles the top 8 cards, and he puts an island from among them onto the field. He then casts a Helm of the Host, and has the Clever Impersonator come in his copy of Linvala. He then moves to resolve and expropriate. Jameson picks time, Josh picks time, Marco picks time, and Chris, the only sane one, chooses money. As a result, Jameson gains 3 extra turns, and he steals Chris's homeward path. Jameson then resolves the long-term plans, and he goes to find a card and puts it 3rd from the top. On Jameson's first extra turn, he sacrifices his copy of Linvala and draws a card. He plays an Okiba Gang Shinobi, and then moves to cast a Crackling Counterpart to make a copy of them. We then move to his next extra turn. On his second extra turn, Jameson sacrifices a token copy of the Shinobi and draws for turn. He then equips the Shinobi with the Helm of the Host, and moving to combat, makes a token copy with haste from the Helm. Jameson swings them at Josh, and with no blockers in sight, Jameson Commander Jutsus in Yuriko. Josh then takes 4 damage from the 2 ninjas and is forced to discard 2 cards, and Jameson also gets 2 Yuriko triggers. He reveals Ink Eyes and Scroll Rack, and Marco hands Josh a tissue to help stop the nosebleed he's developed after realizing he shouldn't have given Jameson those extra turns. This deals a further 8 damage as the Yuriko triggers resolve, and we then move to the next turn. We move to his 3rd extra turn, and Jameson sacrifices the Shinobi on his upkeep. He then casts a Scroll Rack in his main phase, and he gears up Yuriko with the Helm of the Host. Jameson then activates Scroll Rack, putting aside 2 and drawing 2. He plays a Swamp, and he moves to combat, getting a Yuriko token with haste. He swings both copies at Josh, and both connect and see each other connect, which triggers Yuriko's ability 4 times total. Jameson reveals off the top Skullstorm, Ink Eyes again, Invisible Stalker, and Read the Bones, for a grand total of 20 damage with Yuriko's abilities. This takes out Josh and Chris, but sadly leaves Marco in the running. Jameson then casts his Invisible Stalker as a blocker, and he passes turn. At the end of turn, Marco sacrifices his Midnight Reaper to the Viscera Seer, drawing a card and losing 1, then scrying the card to the bottom of his library. He reveals a Kukusha off the top, and he starts his turn. Marco forgets his shoulder trigger on his upkeep, failing to bring anything back. He plays a Twilight Mire off the top of his library, and then a Forest. We see Kukusho hit the field, and Marco counts up his damage, and is pretty sure he's got the game. He swings everything at Jameson, and Jameson blocks the Hulk with the Stalker. Jameson then takes 13, and Marco sacrifices Kukusho to drain him for 5 and gain 5. Marco then sacrifices the Twilight Shepherd to the Seer as well, which comes back with Persist and returns Kukusho to his hand. He then recasts it and sacrifices it to finish off Jameson. Game review time. So that was a bit of a nail-biter. It came very close at the end, and you could almost see that Jameson had that win. If Marco had just taken 2 more damage, the game would have been over on that final extra turn, which is kind of a shame, but that's the way the cookie crumbles. Speaking of Marco, his deck does run Protean Hulk, but he doesn't go for the combo. He uses it more as a value engine, and he's mostly just playing Abzan good stuff for fun. I want to thank Chris for coming out and playing with us, and it was really cool for him to bring his Avacyn deck. I don't remember ever playing against one, so that was interesting to see. He was unfortunately the punching bag for most of the game, as he was playing all the board wipes and dealing with all the bad board states, but unfortunately that made him an enemy of everyone else. I think the person most affected by all these board wipes was Sram, and therefore Josh, and unfortunately, even though he was able to get a lot of card draw out of his commander, he never could really build himself back up to what he had early on. It's a bit of a shame, because I really like Sram as a commander. I think it offers Voltron decks a lot of card draw, and it's actually a pretty good mono-white commander. Please be sure to tune in every Monday and Thursday at 11 AM Eastern Standard Time for a guaranteed new video. You can also follow me on Twitter at MTGMudsta. You can find me on Facebook at facebook.com/MTGMudsta. And lastly, you can check me out when I stream at twitch.tv/MTGMudsta. This video is brought to you in support by my patrons. If you're looking for a way to help out the channel, please be sure to visit the link below. Thank you all for watching this video, and don't forget, friends are just opponents you haven't eliminated yet.